Thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Iker Gil and I'm the founder and editor-in-chief of the nonprofit organization Mass Context based in Chicago. The organization, founded in 2009, explores issues that affect the urban context through publications, events, installations, and other public engagements. You can watch, read, and support our work on our website, masscontext.com. And I just want to thank everybody who has supported our work one way or another one as we achieve 15 years in just a few months. So it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's program, the last of our spring series in 2023. This Sunday, June 25th, architect Harry Seidler would have turned 100 years old, and to commemorate this significant date and to discuss the relevance of his work, we have organized this program with presentations by Vladimir Belogolovsky, author of the book Harry Seidler, Life Work, and curator of the traveling exhibition Harry Seidler, Painting Toward Architecture. We're also thrilled to welcome architect and historian Jean-Louis Cohen, as well as architect Jeremy Edmiston, who work in the office of Harry Seidler. So this event continues our series celebrating the centenary of architects that we started with Walter Netsch in 2020 and that we have continued with Natalie Deblois, Charles Colbert, John Mutusamy, and Victor Lundy. In 2018, we had the pleasure of organizing a screening in Chicago of the film Harry Seidler, Modernist, the first documentary retrospective of Harry Seidler's architectural legacy. And Vladimir made the introductory remarks there. So it's been a pleasure to kind of continue that look at the work of Harry Seidler. On our website, we're including a link with an offer to purchase that film along with Edge of the Possible, a documentary about John Utzon, and the Sydney Opera House. So if you haven't seen any of the two films, this is a great opportunity to do so. As you will hear today, Harry Seidler is widely acknowledged as a leading member of the post-war generation of modernists and one of the most influential architects of the 20th century in the Southern Hemisphere, with commissions not only in Australia, but also in Austria, France, Israel, Italy, Mexico, and Hong Kong since establishing his own practice in Sydney in 1948. His work has influenced the course of modernist design into the 21st century. So let me introduce today's speakers. Vladimir Belogolovsky is an American curator and critic. Educated both in Ukraine and the US, he graduated from the Cooper Union School of Architecture in 1996, and since 2010 has been heading his New York-based nonprofit curatorial project, which focuses on curating and designing architectural exhibitions worldwide. Belogolovsky has interviewed more than 500 international architects and writes for ArchDaily, Arquitectura Viva, Azure, and Steer World. His books include Harry Seidler, Life Work, China Dialogues, Imagine Buildings Floating Like Clouds, Architectural Guides, New York and Chicago, Conversations with Architects and Soviet Modernism, 1955-1985. He has curated and produced over 50 international exhibitions, and in addition to his decade-long Seidler tour, he curated the Architects' Voices series, and Emilian Bas retrospective, and the chess game exhibition for the Russian Pavilion at the 2008 Venice Architecture Biennale. Jean-Louis Cohen is the Sheldon H. Solow Professor in the History of Architecture at the New York University's Institute for Fine Arts. His research of the past decades builds upon his double identity of architect and historian, exploring theory and design from 1900 to the present day. Between 1997 and 2003, he created, on behalf of the French Minister of Culture, the Cité l'Architecture du Patrimoine. Sorry, I'm from Spain. I don't speak French. This is as good as I can do.
Not bad. Not too bad.
A museum, research, and exhibition center, which opened in 2007 in Paris in the Palais de Chalon. He's the author of more than 40 books published in many countries and translated in several languages. In 2021, he was appointed the inaugural Penelope Visiting Professor in Architectural History at the University of Sydney. And a few days ago, the exhibition Constructed Geographies, Paulo Mendes da Rocha, co-curated with Vanessa Grossman, opening in Porto. So congratulations on that. Jeremy Edmiston is a principal at System Architects and an associate professor at the City College of New York School of Architecture. Systems work has won the AIA Wilkinson Award, the AIA New Housing New York Competition, an Australian Timber Design Award, the Bank of America Design Award, the McGraw-Hill Best Construction Award, and the Architizer A+ Award for Architecture and Materials. Perhaps his most influential work is Burst 008, a prefab house commissioned and fully constructed by the Museum of Modern Art. So welcome to all three of you. It is really an honor and a pleasure to have you to discuss Harry Seidler. So for everybody watching, feel free to use the chat feature at any time to share your questions and comments for our speakers. We'll have a few minutes at the end. And with that, I'd like to welcome Vladimir and turn it to him. So.
Okay. Thank you, Iker, for introduction. And I hope everybody's hearing me and seeing the first slide. So in this 1950 photograph, we see Harry Seidler, a very ambitious young man, 27-year-old, who is leaning against a ramp of the just completed house that he designed for his mother, Rose Seidler. This is taking place in Virunga, a northern Sydney suburb. And it was just 2 years earlier, while this Harvard JSD trained architect was happily apprentices at the office of Marcel Breuer in Manhattan, when a very intriguing proposition came from his parents. They wrote him, he received a letter from them saying that we don't want you to come here to Sydney, where they relocated a couple of years before that from Europe right after the war. We don't want you to come here as a visitor. We want to commission you to design and build us a house. So they invited him to come to Sydney. And so this was a way for Rose Seidler to entice their son, who they haven't seen in a long time, to come to Sydney with this project. And he obviously accepted this offer, but he had a couple of conditions that they had to meet. So first, they had to pay for his tickets. And the second condition was that, sorry, I can't change the slides. Okay.
Do you want to
Okay, now it's working. So the second condition was for him to go to Sydney via Brazil, where his modernist idol Oscar Niemeyer practiced. And not only he succeeded in meeting his idol, but he actually managed to work for him for a few months in Rio. And these are a couple of examples of the kind of architecture that he that really influenced his work. So primarily fluid geometry and the ability to tie this architecture specific to the specific climate, which is of course very similar to Australia. The third aspect that really was influential is the ability of Niemeyer to work with a team of artists and landscape designers. And here's one example of Pampuya Church in Belo Horizonte from 1943, where a number of artists contributed to his work. So here you see on the outer shell of the church is a mural by a famous Brazilian muralist, Paula Wernick. And on the right, you can see a very direct influence on Seidler. This is the mural that he did in the Rose Seidler house, which has very similar geometry. And once in Sydney, Harry set up his single-person operation in a tiny little apartment in downtown Sydney. And he put up this, very prominently put up his very ambitious kind of statement, which became his kind of guiding policy. He said, Australia's present-day building practices are outdated. They cry out for rejuvenation. It is the policy of this office to create new standards which will produce a progressive contemporary architecture. And we will see how much of that progressive architecture was produced over the next 60 years of practice. The Rose Seidler house that Harry completed in 1950 in Virunga did more for Australian modern architecture than any other project until that time. So the building really single-handedly delivered a complete package of Bauhaus and modernist principles to the continent, and it became an instant icon and a model for local architects to follow. And as you can see here, the local historian Philip Drew, he said that this house was to become the yardstick of all later modern buildings in Australia. So after all, despite the fact that he was only around 25 when he came to the country, he was really the most experienced architect in the country as far as his very personal experience as far as the education. He was studying at GSD under Gropius and Breuer, worked for Breuer for 2 years. He was studying at Black Mountain College under Joseph Albers, and also worked in Niemeyer's office. Here's an image from the living room of that house overlooking the central terrace. And so you can see that this building, this house, came as a complete package, not only exterior but also interior, complete with all the furniture, such furniture as by Eames, Saarinen, Hardoy, butterfly chairs, modern light fixtures. None of that was actually available at the time in Australia, so all of that was packed in New York and came to Sydney. So so this was a very uncompromising house, and in a way it landed like an alien spaceship. And to be exact, 3 spaceships landed in Virunga, because parallel to this house, he designed a couple of other houses for the extended members for the family, Seidler family. And so these houses became so popular that immediately many commissions from middle-class Australians, middle-class Sydney Seidlers came, and he would not any longer consider going back to New York. He stayed in Sydney, and Sydney became his home. He was born on June 25th, so we'll celebrate that in just 3 days, 1923, celebrate the centennial. He was born into upper middle class Jewish family. His father, Max, and 2 of his brothers owned a textile factory in Vienna. It was confiscated in March 1938, just 1 day after Anschluss, when Hitler annexed Austria. And at that time, to survive, Jews had only one way. They had to get out of the country. Fortunately, his older brother Marcel at that time studied photography in London. He was able to arrange a visa for Harry, and so he came. He was just 15, and he was accepted into Cambridge Polytechnic School, and their parents followed suit after, but in fact already after Kristallnacht in Germany and Austria, just a few days later. And so they were able to, all were able to escape. And in May 1940, Prime Minister becomes Winston Churchill. And the first thing he did, he ordered all male citizens, all male German citizens, and they all came on a German passport. So males from age 16 to 60 in precincts in the south and east of England, they had to be interned as enemy aliens. And about 30,000 people were actually interned. It was later by Churchill, he admitted that it was a mistake years later. And so the brothers were sent to Canada. Harry spent 18 months in an internment camp near Quebec City. And he was released because he was able to apply and he was accepted to the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg, which he graduated from in 1944. He then became Canadian citizen and he received his architectural license to practice architecture. And in 1945, he was accepted by GSD at Harvard, headed by Gropius, who is in the center here, and Seidler, Harry Seidler is right above him with the tie a little bit to the right. So he graduated in 1946. His class had incredibly talented architects who became world famous later on. For example, in the center, with his back to the camera in the vest, that's Ian Pei, who was his classmate. And Gropius told his students that they were really destined to change the world for the better. He didn't treat architecture as a style. He really thought of it as a social project, and he advocated the unification of all practical arts under the umbrella of architecture. And while living in New York, Harry Seidler saw an important exhibition at MoMA that was called Painting Toward Architecture by Henry Russell Hitchcock. And you can also see here a book, which is not just a book, but it's a catalog of that traveling exhibition that traveled widely to about 25 cities in the US. And that exhibition was about establishing very fascinating links between abstract art and architecture. And the exhibit I curated also borrowed the title, Painting Toward Architecture, to show specific links between the works of art and the works of Seidler and artists that he collaborated with. And here's Gropius's own house that he designed with Breuer in Lincoln, Massachusetts. And this is an important, so this is another example of how a particular work of architecture is inspired by a work of art, much more than other architectural precedents. And this was an important place because Gropius would invite his students for Saturday afternoon tea to discuss architecture. And in fact, at that time, contemporary architecture was so rare that it would be, for many students, the first time ever they would encounter really contemporary work of architecture. And so they were really overwhelmed. And paintings, just like I showed in the previous example, for Seidler also became really the most important influence for his work. And so after GSD, Harry studied at Black Mountain College in North Carolina, which was a suggestion by Gropius to take a course of Joseph Albers. And Albers was the one who explored visual tension and ambiguity, color interaction, juxtaposition of patterns, shapes, mirrored symmetry, and repeated and reversed shapes. And so as in his 1943 repetition against the blue, here, so you can see how this work will influence, we'll see a few examples, Seidler's buildings. And you can really see that his work is rooted in Albers' paintings and geometry. So here's another example. It's a plan of a building that was not realized, is really influenced by Auber's study for vice versa. And on the right, you see one of the earliest houses, how the facade is designed in a way as this kind of tension between two elements of the two bulks of the building. And here's Blues Point Tower Apartments, built in Sydney, 61, was actually the tallest building in Australia at that time, just to give you a kind of context. And the patterns of the building's windows were done based on one of the paintings by Joseph Albers. At the time, I have to say that it wasn't just aesthetically designed. At the time, you couldn't build a glass building in Australia due to very restricted fire code. You have to have a solid separation between glass. And so a way to go around it was to use this checkerboard pattern, and he used it, he used the painting to guide him through that. Here's another example of how another building that was not completed was inscribed into one of the drawings by Albers. Marcel Breuer was another very influential kind of force, lifelong mentor. In 46, Breuer stopped teaching at Harvard, and he went to open his studio in New York City. And as that coincided with the time when Seidler graduated from Harvard, so he went to New York, went to see him. Breuer didn't have any commissions at that time, but it didn't stop Seidler. He told him that you are the best architect in the world. I want to work for you. You don't have to pay me now. You can pay me later. So this is how he became the very first employee of Breuer. And just to go over a few examples of Breuer's own projects, which is quite important because there is a very strong connection between the two. So these buildings demonstrate a kind of distinctive style, and Breuer's houses are characterized by their binuclear plans, with a very clear separation between day zone and night zone, and such features as low stone walls extended into the landscape, extensive glazing, deep cantilevers, industrial materials such as steel, columns, and spiral stairs, privacy screens, vertical siding, slanted or butterfly roofs, freestanding sculptural fireplaces with display niches, wood interiors, and furniture designs by Eames, Saarinen, and Breuer himself. Back to Rose Seidler house, what made the house really striking is that not only it came as a complete package from America, it was actually designed fully in America, not in Australia. And the proof of that is this publication to the right in Arts and Architecture magazine, which was already published in January 48. The mother, Rose Seidler, asked Harry to design her a house somewhere in March of that year, but in January it was already not only designed, was published. So how that happened, when Seidler worked at Breuer's office, he befriended another employee, Roland Thompson, who actually asked Seidler to design a house for his own family in Foxborough, Massachusetts. That house was never finished, was never built. And so when his mother asked him to design a house, he decided to realize this particular house. That house was fully realized. So Seidler came with this model, he came with his drawings, and the real mission was not to design a house, but to find a site for the house that was already designed. And he spent some months looking for the right site. He found a very similar site. And one of the only changes that he did, he had to move the sun awnings to the other side due to the fact that the sun in Australia shines from the other side. And another one of a few other changes was that he added the mural, which was a lesson from Brazil. 20 years later, he did a house for himself, for him and Penelope Seidler. And so this is 1967, 20 years later. And this, I would say, is a true mid-career manifesto. Unlike other previous houses, this was an opportunity to design it in concrete. It's a very large house, about 400 square meters. And this house is largely based on this composition on the left, which is a painting by Theo van Doesburg, Space-Time Construction number 3. And it is made of interlocking planes of, well, the composition is interlocking planes of different colors, and the house itself is really made of, it's a composition of interlocking planes of different materials such as brick, concrete, and glass. And so it's a very kind of, it's a continuum. What it achieved is a kind of continuum dynamic flow of interlocking and seemingly unenclosed spaces. And just a couple of words about this painting. This was his favorite painting. It was painted in the year he was born. This was a painting that participated in that exhibition at MoMA. It's in the book. And Penelope Seidler actually located the painting when it was auctioned and purchased it, and it was given, it was presented to him for his 69th birthday. When he passed away in 2006, she donated the painting to the National Gallery. When we had an exhibition in Sydney, it was actually possible to get this painting, for this painting to come from Canberra to Sydney, and it came with its own curator, and the whole lighting was adjusted in the entire exhibition to comfort this particular painting because it's very, very fragile. And just to show you how this building works, so it has a very small presence from the street. It's on a slope, so you come from the top. There is a carport for 2 cars, then you take the stair, go down, and you enter the house from the bridge, from upper level. In a way, it's a rectangular house, so you can say that it was conceived as a 2-story house, which was split in 2, pulled apart. There is a stair that went into that gap in between the 2 halves. And so, and it was shifted in a way that the house became full level kind of house. And it has this wonderful continuum of spaces, this seemingly unenclosed spaces that kind of provoke looking beyond. And the only enclosed spaces are 4 bedrooms, and the rest is basically one singular space. So this a couple of images outside the sunny side on the north and on the interior side. So you can see, you can still recognize very distinctive Breuer features, but the composition already is quite balanced and in a way you know, settled and Seidler already kind of Seidler-like. What I want to say about the house is that it became a very important depository of the family's art collection. And Many of the acquired pieces were by Joseph Albers or his students in America, such as Norman Carlberg, Charles Perry. There are also pieces by Alexander Calder and Frank Stella. And what is interesting about many of these artworks is that they speak in a way the same language. They share geometry of a circle. So you can see these quadrants and semicircles and three-quarter circles and circles everywhere. And they are not just there for decoration. It's very actually important that the artworks spoke to the architect in a very interesting way, because his work to this moment never really explored circles. There is not a single circle or curve in this particular house, but you will see how his architecture will change. And the change, I believe, would be really influenced by these artworks. This is Australia Square, built actually the same year as the house. It's in a way, it became a modernist icon, art icon of Sydney. It's a 50-story freestanding tower, which is it sits on a public square. That's where the name comes from. There is another low-rise office block, and it was the first collaboration with Dick Dusseldorp, the local developer, who became a very important client. And Sydney critic Elizabeth Farrelly said about this building, she said, Australia Square gave Sydney a sense of growing up, a sense of confidence. It was really our first glittering version of a skyscraper. So this building, in a way, hinged Sydney into the 20th century. And this was also the first collaboration with Italian engineer Pierluigi Nervi. So you can see some of his work on the right, and on the left, you see on the upper side, this is a ceiling plan of ripped ceiling plan of the ground floor and the first floor, and on the lower part is a typical floor. So Nervi designed this plans, this ceilings, and also exterior columns. There are 20 exterior columns along the perimeter, and they are tapered in a very elegant way. And another important element of this project is the sculpture designed by Alexander Calder. And so speaking with the developer, Harry said that we are creating this new progressive symbol of Sydney. Wouldn't it be great if we put in front of this building really great work of art, sculpture? And he added that he would not settle for anything other than the greatest artwork in the world. So the developer asked him, where do you get this kind of sculpture? And he responded that obviously you have to go around the world to find it. So he convinced the developer to finance the strip, and he went on a 1 month long around the world trip with Penelope Seidler in search for the sculptor. So they met people like Isamu Noguchi, Henry Moore, Harry Bertoia, and with Alexander Calder twice in France and in the US. And finally, they chose Calder and to commission. So this was not purchased. It was a commissioned sculpture that was, they actually did exchange a number of sketches. And so this is called Cross Blades, and it's a kind of tense fusion of art and engineering, which was something that Seidler was trying to achieve. This is government offices in Canberra. So maybe not exactly the most appealing building in the world, but I think it's important to show it because in a way it directed Seidler in a very different direction from what he was doing before this building. So it may look like a kind of car garage structure, even though these are actually offices. The plan is not much more cheerful in a way. So it's very basic. It has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 6, 7 kind of rectangular office blocks, which are connected by 6 circular stairs. There are very few elements that are repeated many, many times. There is a photograph of this under construction. So it's a kind of kit of parts, mechanism set. This photograph is quite interesting. It's showing how the building is built, and he calculated that it took only 7 minutes on average for each of this enormous multi-tone member, such as these beams, 7 minutes to go into its final location. And it didn't really need anything else. This was the final look. So it's a, it's a very kind of modernist expression, modernist building where you can see the bones of the building. There is no separation between interiors and exterior. In a way, you see, it's not covered up. It's a very kind of honest building. And this is a very surprising view. This is the side plan and the roof plan combined of this very building. So this looks extremely different, very, in a way, exotic. And what is interesting about this drawing or painting-like drawing is that there are these geometric objects that in a way constitute a kind of genetic code of Seidler's architecture, not to this moment, but Seidler's architecture that will happen from then on. So you can almost literally find certain buildings that Seidler will create years later. So this is a very fascinating kind of genetic code for architecture that anticipated his work. Another person who was really influential is Norman Carlberg. So he was also Joseph Albers' student at Yale in the 1950s. The architect and sculptor collaborated actually very intensely. And what's interesting about Carlberg is that he wasn't a full-time sculptor. He was a teacher of sculpture. And he only did, he realized his works on very few occasions, only when he had commissions. He struggled to get commissions. And Harry Seidler, in a way, discovered him as a sculptor. And he established a very interesting, very intimate relationship with him. And together they've done many, many projects together. And Seidler was entirely responsible for Carlberg's sculptures in Australia. Carlberg never been to Australia. He actually traveled very little. He never been to Europe, and didn't really travel much outside of Baltimore, where he lived. So Seidler was really responsible for choice of materials, the scale, dimensions, placement, details, how it was manufactured, lighting, and sometimes he would even define the color. So he treated the sculptor as a consultant, but all the decisions he made himself. So the sculptor provided the sketches and not much more. And so on the lower left, you see one sculpture which went into one courtyard, rectangular courtyard. So this is made of blackened steel. It's made of just one unit, which is a quadrant extruded and repeated 16 times in a shape of this kind of ceremonial portal. And on the right, you have another sculpture made of concrete that went into the second courtyard, and it's made up of 12 units of two types. So this is solid concrete. One is twisted to the left, one is twisted to the right, and it's a stack of 4, 4, and 4, 12 sculptures in total. And what is interesting about this relationship between the sculptor and the architect is that there is a letter that Seidler wrote to Norman Karlberg in 1969, and he says, "I love the thing you gave me during my last trip. In fact, I am enclosing some pictures to show that it has had quite an effect on me." So this is very interesting. So these are images that he enclosed, and you can see how in the project that he worked on at the time in Sydney, which was not realized, how his buildings have become, in a way, enlarged Karlberg sculptures. So this is quite interesting connection. Australian Embassy on the left bank in Paris. So there are two wings, the Chancellery with Ambassador's apartment on top, and residential apartment building for Australian diplomats and families. A tree-like element was designed by Pierre Louis Genurvi. So this marks what is it? Port cachere for the cars to arrive in style. You can see on the left, you can see sunbreakers, sun awnings by Breuer. So this was a collaboration between Seidler, Breuer, and Pierre Louis Genurvi. But what is even more interesting is the plan of this building. So you can see how so there is a diagram on the right that shows two opposing quadrants and how it's related to some of the works of Frank Stella. So Frank Stella was another artist whose work really influenced Seidler quite a bit. So he did protractors series from late 1960s to early 1970s. So here you can see 27 diagrams, compositions. They are made up of quadrants, semicircles, circles again, based on circular cities in Asia Minor that the painter, that the artist visited. And overall, he did about 100 paintings. So each diagram guided about 3 paintings that he did. So each painting is a pattern of intersecting concentric shapes. And here you have a kind of side by side. You see 21 comparative plan diagrams of Harry Seidler's buildings. Not all of them were complete, but many were. And again, I am directing you to this plan of the building in Canberra, which actually combines almost like a mothership of all of the buildings that were built later. So you can kind of find them in that plan, really. This is again how Stella can be found in Seidler's work. So there are certain elements of the buildings that were taken directly from Stella's paintings. And here you see Seidler's building, Stella's painting, and Norman Karlberg's positive negative sculptural piece side by side. And you can see how they are talking to each other in a very direct way. So here are geometric and mathematically generated plans by the Baroque architect Francesco Baramini. So his work provided endless inspiration for Seidler by inscribing geometric figures into his plans. Seidler brought, in a way, symbolism, complexity, structural considerations, and historical references to his architecture. So, and all of that was aspiring to elevate buildings to an art form. Validated by layers of meaning. So order, proportions, beauty. And another sculptor, Charles Perry, who worked a lot with Seidler. So here you can see on the left, it seems to be a very flamboyant, expressive sculpture. This is inside Royal Theatre inside of MOC Center, 60-story tall skyscraper in Sydney. But in reality, it's a very rigorously designed, very basic, in a way, sculpture made up of a repetition of just a single element, which is just a semicircular wire. So this is kind of ingeniously put together. And there is another yellow sculpture on the right, also standing next to MLC in Sydney. And again, it looks very flamboyant, but all it is a repetition of a single unit, which is a quadrant in elevation and triangle in section. And it's put together into this very kind of expressive, very fluid sculpture. And so at least 200 projects were done by Harry Seidler. Around 160 were built in all in all Australian cities in a way, plus several cities in Europe, in Hong Kong. Obviously, we don't have time to go over even the most important ones. And in Sydney, his buildings are very prominent in a way. In certain places, you can see so many of them that it appears to be almost like a Seidler city. And in the middle, on the bottom, in the middle image, you can see three towers. So there is Australia Square on the left, Grosvenor Place in the middle, and Cove Apartments on the right. So this is where Harry and Penelope Seidler apartment is located on one of the upper floors. So if you go there and you look out, you will see at least a dozen of prominent structures designed by Harry Seidler. On the right side, you see Alliance Francaise building, finished in 2010. So already 4 years after Harry Seidler passed away in 2006. So this is his last work. And obviously, many awards were given to Harry Seidler. I'll just mention one. So he was given in 1996. He was awarded RIBA Rebar Gold Medal, which is obviously very prestigious award. For example, the next year was given to Tado Anda, and 2 years after, in '98, it was given to Oscar Niemeyer. So 2 years after Harry Seidler.
Vladimir, I hate to cut you, but it's like we want to make sure that we have time for everybody. So it's 12:50. So.
And this is I'm finishing. So the exhibition went to 32 different cities in 20 countries. These are 2 books that became kind of like side projects for me. And I'm giving the floor to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Vladimir. And again, sorry for cutting you off like right at the end. We're gonna move to Jean-Louis Cohen. Jean-Louis, you're on the mute. Yep. Jean-Louis, if you can unmute yourself. We can't hear you right now.
Yes, you should be able to hear me.
Yep,
yes.
hear you perfect now.
I was saying that it's not so easy to follow the steps of Vladimir, who has done a fantastic job in the archives, in interviewing many witnesses and looking very carefully, as we've seen, at the buildings. So his contribution is a remarkable example of a piece of monographic work which is not obsessively focused on the hero, but which really interweaves Seidler's work into a series of issues. So I won't be very creative and original. I will try to show you a few. I hope I have my full screen. Do you see a full screen? Yes. So I want to show you the building which made me aware of the existence of Harry Seidler, the Australian embassy. We've just seen it. I was a student. I was finishing my studies in Paris, and this was clearly a totally exceptional building in the French landscape, which at that time was very depressing. So for us students, architects were criminals who were making money with shabby low-cost housing. Le Corbusier was academic, and there were very few architects who had a meaning and a promise. I would mention Lucan, of course, or Jim Sterling, and Harry Seidler with his building in Paris, which announced something different. It announced an architecture which was constructed well, which has a dynamic form, which has a monumental potential at a moment in which the term monument was taboo in the architectural discourse. So for me, it remained, and it remains to this day, I will return to it, a very important contribution, not only to Paris or to the work of Seidler, but to the global architectural scene of the second 20th century. I also was drawn, my attention was also drawn to Harry with the publication of his monograph, partial monograph of his work, which made me aware of things that were happening in Australia. I had no clue, and but it took me a while, and forgive me to be personal at the beginning of this very short talk, it took me a while to see the buildings in real life. I visited the Rose Seidler house in 2017, so about 6 years ago, with Harry Margalit, an excellent Australian architectural historian, and was really struck by it. It also triggered further interest, meeting with Penelope later, and returning to Sydney. So for me, this house is a very significant turning point, not only again in Harry's work, but in post-war architecture at the global stage. Yes, I think we have to locate Harry in the post-war architectural culture. This is what Vladimir has done. I think we have to, as with every architect, we have to locate him in his generation. His generation is the generation of the second generation of students of the Bauhaus after those trained in Germany. So he was in a sort of generation 1.5 or 2.5, a mid-generation after the founders of a so-called modern movement, with, as has already been seen, a very eclectic take at architecture. Harry was not a true believer in the international style, a very dubious concept, but he was very aware of the international scene. He was a traveler and a photographer, and I insist on this aspect of Harry's work, which has not been touched by Vladimir, who could not talk about everything. Harry was an observer. He looked at architecture. And this is for me very important. Architecture is also, I would say, a sport of observation. sometimes with a sketchbook, sometimes with a camera. This is what Harry did, and he did it with his brilliant photos published 20 years ago. He did it also, thank you, Vladimir, for giving me a document. He did it also in order to document technically the projects he was interested in. So this is, for me, a very compelling photo album, views of a building by Harry Cobb inside IMP's office, as you know, of the Place Ville-Marie in Montreal, which served, you see the date, Harry, to reflect on his first designs for high-rises. So I would say that Harry was an observer, and this is for me very, very significant. At the same time, and I take this term, which I really love, from Vladimir's introduction to his big Rizzoli monograph, Harry admitted to have been a sponge. And I really like this term. For me, it's a very important term. Being a sponge is what makes great architects. In fact, and this is very clear in the case of Harry, there are three major sources in an architect's training. One is, of course, your teachers, clearly. The second, in this case, Gropius. The second are the people with whom you work. The people, here we see Harry with Gropius in 54 in Sydney. Young Harry and elderly Gropius. I think it's a very beautiful photo. So in my triangle, you learn with your teachers. You learn with the architects with whom you work. In that case, Breuer, Marcel Breuer, and also Oskar Niemeyer, as already said. And the third point is learning from the, what I would call the cultural bath, learning, absorbing what you can see, what is going on. And Harry has been an excellent observer, as shown, of art as well as architecture. I would say that Breuer really, Seidler has to be put really within two systems. One is the international migration of architects which followed the takeover of the Nazis in Germany. So a diaspora of architects to Russia, South America, Western Europe, and the US. And I think this made of Harry, and I think that this aspect of his biography must be explored, what I would call a wandering Jew. A wandering Jew going, of course, a citizen of the Axis. Austrian, had become German citizen, but he was at the same time a Jew, and this Jewish dimension for me is something which remains to explore in his ideas, in his views of the world, even if he was totally secular. This is, I think, as far as I know, this is a very important component. The other one is the continuity of the Bauhaus. There were very few architectural students at the Bauhaus before Hannes Meyer and Mies van der Rohe, a few dozens. But there were many who were fed by the indirect second-generation Bauhaus culture, and not only architecture, but also, as said by Vladimir, art, thanks in particular to Albers. So I would also inscribe the work of Harry in this dissemination of the Bauhaus. Now, if we look, there are many other inputs which are, again, creatively transformed. If we return to the Rose Seidler house, we see that it can be inscribed in many kind of discourses. Look at the ramp, at the incredibly, astonishingly, and maybe revoltingly slender pilotis, which seems to be crutches more than real supports. Of course, it's difficult not to think of Le Corbusier's work on the ramp, of the architectural promenade of Le Corbusier, on his insistence at having houses float above the ground. It's also, of course, if we look inside, I've always been interested in the fireplaces in architecture, and it's clear that the fireplaces of Harry have a relationship with those of Breuer. If I'm not mistaken, he worked on this house, Vladimir, is that right, for Breuer, the Geller house?
Yes, yes, this was, I think, the first one.
Okay, so you see, this is Sydney, this is North Sydney, this is This is the gallery house on which he worked. So the theme of the hearth, the center of the house, the fireplace, which was very important for, of course, as you know, for Frank Lloyd Wright, was not so important for people like Gropius, but fundamental for the Americanized Bauhaus student, Marcel Breuer. The relationship to Niemeyer has been mentioned, and it's a very interesting one, because in a way, Harry was able to reconcile Gropius and Niemeyer, who hated each other. Niemeyer was totally hateful in respect to Niemeyer, who had scorned his beautiful house in Canova, asking, dear Oscar, how can you prefabricate it? So they didn't get along very well. And what I find interesting in the Williamson house, which is the most Niemeyer-esque of all the projects by Harry, is that it looks strangely like the last projects of Niemeyer himself. So it's a sort of reverse influence, imaginary, of course, as if Seidler's interpretation of Niemeyer had in the end a feedback on the work of Niemeyer himself. Okay, then the Killara house, I know that Jeremy will mention it at length. I just want to make one point. It has been very brilliantly discussed by Vladimir, and it's a splendid, it's really a major house of the 20th century. It goes beyond every boundary. I'm interested. I was puzzled when I saw it last September with Penelope. Here we see the living room. It's one of my photos. We see, of course, the collections of art. And I've been interested in a parallel with the house I had just seen before, which is Adolf Loos's Miller house, which has, even if it's very different, it's a compact block on a slope in a suburb of Prague, but the same idea of having two different types of spaces connected by a system of stairs operates well. So I have no clue about Seidler. It is clear that Harry could not ignore Loos. I don't know how well he knew this house, which had been built late and was not extremely well published, but I see a convergence in the spatial invention, and here I would add to your very good comparison with Van Doesburg an allusion to Loos's Raumplan, to Loos's spatial plan. And then, of course, we have this magnificent skyscraper in Sydney, Australia Square, which is interesting. The semantics of it are interesting. Australia Square is a sort of metonymy. It is a metonymy. The building takes its name from the square, and but at the same time, Australia, it becomes a synecdoche. As you know, it's the rhetorical figure in which a part represents the whole. It becomes a synecdoche of all Australia. So I think it's a very important high-rise. If we look again at the rather boring, sinister panorama of high-rise construction after in the 1960s. And of course, the relationship with Nervi is a very important one. And here we have to insist on the fact that there has been very few stimulating couples with architects and engineers. One of them was, of course, Niemeyer and Joaquin Cardoso. Without Cardoso, Niemeyer would never have done his best buildings. And when Cardoso died, Niemeyer lost it. I would mention also Le Corbusier and Vladimir Bodiansky, Peter Behrens, and Karl Bernhardt. But in this case, I think the relationship with Nervi is extremely stimulating. You see here a building which has, if you see the way in which the ribs are organized here, the same kind of radiating structure. I would also insist on another aspect, and this is one of the last buildings I will show. I know that Jeremy will also mention it, the offices and apartments overlooking Sydney at a distance, magnificent building, which contributes to another aspect of Harry Seidler's invention, which is what I would call his typological fantasy. his ability at recasting accepted building types and rethinking them, rethinking the office building, and in a way, introducing another parallel in his reflection, the work, for instance, of Le Corbusier and the Milliner building in Ahmedabad, which is not an office building, but in which the compactness, the photo is a little exaggerated here, the compactness of the building, the thickness of the facade, the existence of open floors and these concrete trees on top, I see a very strong parallel. And let me return as a conclusion to my initial discovery of Harry's work, The Embassy in Paris. I think it's Vladimir had discussed the plan and its geometry in relationship again with the work of artists. We could also talk about its urbanity, and here again, like in the case of Australia Square, I think that Harry was capable of capturing in one single building urban tensions which were operating at a much larger scale. Here, the tensions operating between the Eiffel Tower, the Palais de Chaillot, you see the curve here, the same curve and the counter curve. It is very easily, even after Jean Nouvel's Musée du Quai Branly here, the best contribution to this extremely strong and important site of Europe. And also this building, my last slide, is also through the work done with Nervi, but also through the contribution of Breuer, is a good example of the tectonic quality of the work of Harry, and I wanted to conclude with that. He has been able to rethink the skin of buildings with aesthetic effects which are never arbitrary, but are always inscribed in a structural way of thinking. This is what I would call an excellent example of constructed geometry, the term I've used for Paulo Mendes da Rocha, constructed geometry, a geometry which comes sometimes from the work of the artist, but which is inflected because it is a condensation also of very strong aesthetic beliefs. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jean-Louis. That's a remarkable series of thoughts that complement, I think, great what Vladimir had shared. So, Jeremy will.
Thanks. Thanks, Iker. I'll just share my screen. Is that?
That's perfect.
That's perfect. Okay. So those are great photos of the projects, Jean-Louis. I really appreciated those photos. Yours, I assume. Vlad asked me to talk about working for Harry. So I'm trying not to talk about the work itself, but what it was like working. I worked for Harry Seidler and Associates from 1983 to 1991. And I think of it as my first 10 years in architecture. It was, I was studying at night in university. I was studying architecture at the same time. So it was a very intense time of learning and working. And it also took me 6 months to get the job. So, you know, I sort of expanded the time a little bit to 10 years. I really fell in love with architecture working in Harry's office. I was a teenager when I started, and I was in my mid-20s when I left to come to New York, where I've been ever since I came to study at Columbia. So my stories of working with Harry are really the stories of a young person. Everybody who worked at Harry's office, you know, I'm sure have their own different stories. The office was full of people from folk from Asia and Africa, Europe, the UK, the Americas, as well as Sydney. Often people would come for a few months and stay a few years. The images that in preparing the talk, you know, I talked to, I'd like to thank Greg Holman. I talked to, he was there when I started and he's still in the office. Dirk ex-Meineke started with me and is still working with in the office. Polly Seidler, Harry's daughter, she did some amazing fact-checking for me. And the images that I'm showing here today are mostly from Vlad's book, which is terrific, and Peter Blake's book. But the images mostly are taken by Max Dupain, a photographer that Harry worked with for most of, well, from 54 to 91, when more or less when Max passed away. When I started in the office, there was 5 others. It grew to about 50 when I was there, and there was about 30 when I left. And when I visit Sydney, I try to stop by and say hi to the folk who are there, who are still there, or I try and meet up with others that I worked with from that time. And recently I found out about a semi-annual or quarterly reunion dinner and a monthly card game that's played between the folk who worked in the office. And I've noticed in the conversations that we have that they're full of admiration and detail of the work that we did. They're still, those days are still high points in our life. It struck me that the friendships are still current and the friendships are still valued from that time from working in the office. And it occurred to me that we're always looking at Harry's work, at his buildings, but, you know, I think Harry also built a work culture, and he built a community around the projects that we made. He built a community around this idea of modern architecture that he so sort of loved. And the community, like his buildings, continued. Here's the office. It was built in 73, 10 years before I arrived. It was 10 years old. It's still there. The office is still in the top 2 floors. Every day seemed very kind of routine. I arrived just before 9 by train or by ferry. Sometimes I drove. The ramp on the left goes up. And you can see on the left here, the cars have a tremendous view of the sunset overlooking the harbour and Lavender Bay below. The first spot was always Harry Citroen, then it was Penelope's Honda, and then Peter Hurst's Citroen, which was always formerly Harry Citroen. And Peter Hurst was the associate who had been with Harry from very, very early. He would say almost the beginning. After that hierarchy, it was a free-for-all, parking in Harry's garage. The lobby, of course, is you walk past the Jean Moreau that was hanging on the wall when I was there up the elevator. And at the top of the building, you can see the section on the right, the office, and this is the office view of the office, the drawing office on the left. It's the 5th floor. It has a stair up to a mezzanine. It has a double height space. It's got a bridge to an outside courtyard, and then another stair up to the roof. The outside courtyard beautiful space where we mostly photographed models and photographed drawings for the office. The mezzanine was occupied by sort of the formal offices and kind of formal conference room. But the fifth floor was where we all worked. Trying to reduce my screen. Anyway, the plan on the right, you can see the sort of the entrance from the elevator to this this half privacy wall, which behind that were the filing cabinets and a countertop where we'd pull all the drawings out and review them. You can see the desks of the drawing office. And in front of the drawing office, you can see in the plan these kind of narrow slots. So the one, the corner office, the corner glass, that was Penelope. Penelope got the corner glass office. Then it was Peter Hurst, the associate, then Harry. And then the one next to that sort of changed. And below that was a conference room, a sort of a meeting room. So it was all open. If you sat at the front desks, you would hear Harry's conversations. Harry was on the phone for a lot of the day, and you would eavesdrop into what he was talking about. If somebody wanted some audio acoustic privacy, you would have to change floors, essentially. So we all kind of participated in the work together, and we heard what was going on around us. For a while, we all wore gray jackets. Harry brought them back from China on one of his trips and gave them to everyone. And we would put them on over our outfit. And so everybody had the same gray jacket. They were supposedly to symbolize dedication and work from China. But Harry wore one as well as Peter, which would surprise sort of visitors when they saw him in his stiff shirt and bow tie coming out with his gray jacket that everybody in the drawing office was wearing. I mean, eventually they got pretty dirty, and the washing of them was an issue. But it was an interesting sort of uniform that we adopted for a while. The routine of the day included a morning and afternoon circuit by Harry around the desks. He would do the loop and would often sort of try and talk to everyone about the drawing or about the project that they were working on. And the discussions were, very animated. They could get quite animated because Harry had an eye for spotting errors. 2 desks away, he would see something on a drawing that wasn't quite right. And there was no hiding. He would bring it up, and one would have to defend one's mistakes or one's position in the drawing. I imagine it was kind of a little bit like sport, where everybody knows what you're capable of. Your strengths and your weaknesses are exposed. They're visible. They're open. But along with that comes a kind of a camaraderie, a sort of respect. And I think what was sort of interesting about this office, this drawing office, is that it was focused on the project, and the project was always talked of in terms of doing as good as a project could possibly be. This was the sort of the measure, the way that everything was discussed. So we were in some ways all on the same team. In the foreground of this image, on the left is this black granite table with a concrete base, and every afternoon and morning at 11 o'clock and 4 o'clock, the office would gather around this table for a 10-minute coffee break, which was only extended if an associate or Harry would be discussing architecture and expect everyone to and participate and continue with the conversation. Otherwise, the timing was often quite strict. The table was full of international architecture magazines. And these were things that we would talk about around coffee. This was the focus, the discussion. This is the table that I first learned about American grad schools from a Yaley who was working in the office for a while, and that I eventually had a tremendous impact on my career. The building itself is, as Jean-Louis has sort of shown us, it's a poured-in-place concrete core and frame with infill precast concrete. We used to call these T-beams that support the floor, but they also serve as the ceiling beneath the floor. And they're sculpted. The shape of them is sculpted to express the shear and the bending in the beam, in the span. Three sides of the building are glass, and the ends, the east and the western end, have precast concrete sun blades in front of the glass. And here you can see that the services hang beneath the T-beams. The services are the heating and the cooling and the lighting. And they're also exposed, obviously, and so nothing in the building is hidden. There's no build outs, there's no sheetrock. The work of the building is completely visible, and it's in some ways it's a little bit like the way the office worked. There's a sort of an exposure, a visibility to it all, to the work. To the discussions. These are upstairs. And then, of course, there's the view. Yeah. Tremendous view. This is the view. This is the upstairs office, but it's also exactly the same view in the drawing room. There was sort of an equality of experience, in a way, to the office and to working. We were all standing on the edge here, looking out into something that was happening on the harbour. It was, I think it was the Queen's visit. She came in her yacht. We were all looking at this boat. And somebody said, so what, at the time, we were building, Harry was building Grosvenor Place, and he had a side office over at Grosvenor Place. Grosvenor Place is a 45-story office building across the harbour. You could almost see it from the office. And so somebody asked the question, well, what would happen if everybody did what we're doing on Grosvenor Place when it's finished? And it's a smart question because, engineers use uniform distributed load when they calculate floors. And this is anything but, if everybody in the building is standing on one edge. So, the discussion, there were stiffening plates added to that structure, I believe, after that. Now, opposite the view was the meeting room. It was small, it's a windowless, and it has floor-to-ceiling awards framed on the walls. It's an interesting context for the office to conduct all of its business meetings. Iker, with you, do I have to wrap this up or?
No, you're good. You're good.
Oh, okay. Sorry. So, a couple of things about the day. It was mostly done by 6 o'clock. And when I worked on the high-rise buildings, I worked on Riverside and Shell for 2 years apiece. There was often like a 5:30 FedEx deadline to get the drawings out to the site the next day. When I worked on those buildings, I worked in a team of about 5, and we would draw as the building was being built. So we're drawing the construction details and trying to stay ahead of the construction. This method was called fast track. But it was surprisingly, it was always a surprise to people that we talked about that there was so few in the team. And each of these buildings was more or less 2 years, of work. One of the activities that happened after 6 was that there was an engineer, a friend of the office. He obviously did a lot of projects for the office, but he would come by after 6 for scotch with Peter Hurst to chat and share the gossip, but he was always open to questions. So this was a time that I and many others learned how to size steel and concrete pieces for everything from furniture to towers. It was like a sort of a informal structures education. Another thing that would happen after 6 was the design meetings, invitation only, as far as I was concerned, in my tenure. And it was after 6 because the phones wouldn't ring, the office was quiet, it was relaxed, and the designers would sit around the table sketching back and forth ideas with Peter and with Harry, of course. And they were they're very relaxed, conversational, in my experience, events. In the office, we'd also we'd also go on site visits. It was important that everybody in the office would experience all of the projects. And so the project architect of the smaller projects in Sydney would take tours of people from the office around to see the building, see what was happening, see how they were doing it, seeing what the details were about. And the interstate projects, there were always there were plane trips organized for us on the teams to go out and see the projects, to be connected with what the construction was. And I always sort of appreciated that experience of the work. The office, being a part of the office, working in the office, wasn't just about producing the drawings. Harry, Jean-Louis talked about Harry's observation and the way that worked, I think, in the office with his buildings was he was obsessed almost with documentation. So a project was never finished until Max Dupain photographed it. And Max would come with his large format cameras, and Harry would shadow him with his Leica. And there was, in the residential projects, there was always a truckload of furniture and furnishings and so forth to be brought in and arranged for the photographs. But it was sort of this interesting idea that even though the construction was done and the clients were moved in or it was being used, the work was still in progress until we were able to get these photos. And the photos lived printed out in leather portfolios above Harry's desk, and they were constantly used, constantly brought out. Look at how this works, look at how that works, look at what we did here, and then even served as a sort of a way of remembering the projects. So I was trying to think about how does one talk about working for someone. And I thought of this question: how did Harry live a modern life? How was Harry modern? How did the practice of modernism work in his life? And Jean-Louis and Vlad have talked about his trips and his photographs, and we would see those photographs every year at the annual slide show. It was usually around Christmas or New Year. And it was basically a Harry lecture for an hour or so, and he would show us those photos that he took. They would show us what he was thinking about, what he had seen. And these were annual sort of events. His round the world trip was this important activity for him. It was part of his practice. I like to think of it as the answer. You know, he was more than Australia, and this travel was a way of being more than Australia constantly. You know, Vlad has talked about the people that he collected, the artists, you know, and the consultants, nervy. One of my first jobs was tracing a drawing that was made on rice paper by Desideri, who had taken over Luigi Nervi's practice. I was still a teenager, and I put the mylar over this rice paper. I had no idea what rice paper even was, or how it was used. And it was of the ceiling of the Riverside building. That relationship extended beyond Nervi's life with Harry. But Harry would collect other people. He would collect lighting engineers, Claude Engel, Edison Price from America. He was always working with others, the artists, of course. But there were also shopping trips, not just the gray jackets that we wore, but he would buy hardware. He would buy locks. He would say, American locks are better than Australian ones. We've got to use this. Faucets, furnishings, anything that would fit in the suitcase, Harry would buy and bring over to make his buildings with. He liked the Seagram taps that Mies designed for the Seagram building, and he would buy those in America. And when they stopped making them, he went to the manufacturer, the story goes, no way of verifying this, that Harry went to the manufacturer and brought the molds. He bought the molds from them and brought them to Australia. And he got Australian manufacturers to make these Seagram taps. There were, of course, many, they were used a lot in Australia. And so there's these ranges of Seagram taps and Seagram knockoffs that Australian manufacturers would produce for the market. But this is, you know, part of the life of being modern, I think, for Harry. Was constantly be, you know, looking for these a way to make. Another way that I think. So another way that he, I think was important, you know, for Harry in a way, is that he built for himself. He built his own Sydney. He built his version of Sydney. You know, the others have sort of mentioned this, but think about it. In the 40s and 50s, he builds his mum's house, his brother's house, and his uncle's house. He also makes his apartment and the studio that he works in until the 1960s. He's living in that. In the 60s, he builds his own house, his family house. The 70s, he builds his office. The 80s, he builds this building next to the office that it has an apartment. You can see that the plan on the lower right, and you can see the sort of lecture room where we saw the slides in the apartment. He builds this in the 80s. In the 90s, he builds the building next door to it. Every 10 years, he's basically building a building for himself. So, you know, his experience of Sydney is an experience of his architecture and his buildings. You know, he also had the habit of purchasing apartments in the buildings that he built. There were, when I was in the office, 3 of us lived in apartments that he owned. We effectively were paying rent, or we had some kind of arrangement with him. Mine was had a view of the harbour, the Opera House, the bridge. It had a parking spot. It's a 1-bedroom. It had a pool on the roof. And before I moved in, Harry was very concerned that the apartment had become it was now in a neighborhood that was very dangerous. If he only knew. It was full of great bars and restaurants, in my opinion. but Harry was fully invested in his own work. He owned it. He built it for himself. He designed it for himself. You know, and I think this is a sort of an important way of sort of understanding Harry and the culture and the way that he was able to build a culture around making modernism. And that's, you know, why I sort of come to this project that we've seen before. You know, I agree with Vlad and Jean-Louis. It's this is you know, a remarkable. I still think this is one of the most remarkable family environments designed to be in Sydney's dry sclerophyll forest on the sandstone shelf. You know, I think it's way of embedding family life into that environment is just extraordinary. And I'm really, you know, I don't think it's sort of being surpassed. I had the good fortune of spending a lot of time in this house as a teenager. And of course, you know, I'd never seen anything like it when I came onto it. And of course, you know, it became sort of the standard of what a house should be, or what a domestic environment should be. So on the left, you know, is up the hill is where the access street is, and you can see the carport cantilevering over. And then on the left, on the right, is down the hill where there's a creek that runs at the bottom of this. You know, if you look at the section at the right, at the top, you see if you're standing at the carport, your eye is at the level of the roof. So it becomes this kind of, this, I think Penelope has called it a horizon line, or you know, the roof is actually, you know, has been lifted up or angled almost, right, to be sort of right on your horizon line. So you don't actually see the mass, becomes this kind of plane as you sort of approach it from this very small sort of opening in the road. And then you go down the stairs and you wind your way onto the bridge. The plan on the left at the top is the entrance plan. On the left at the entrance is Harry's library and study that leads onto a deck, an outdoor deck. On the right is the kitchen, and then the dining room, and those are all on the upper level. And then that U, that structural U that Vlad talked about from the painting, is cantilevers out into the landscape to the north, where you get all the sun. You go down the stairs to the living room and the master bedroom, and then down the stairs again to the kids' bedrooms and play area, and down there also Harry has a drawing studio, beautiful studio at the bottom of the house, looking into the forest where he draws. And then there's a bathroom there where I once discovered a Cristo. It was a brush wrapped by Cristo. And here's you can see the sort of the roof plan, the mass of the roof, and the pool to the upper left at the bottom of the hill. And you can see that to the right, the northern side of the house is a kind of it's a lawn, a landscaped lawn that faces the sun, and the dining room and living room and the decks, and then to the south is the forest. There's Harry's study on the left at the entrance. Harry let me use his library when I was doing my undergraduate thesis, and I was writing on Le Corbusier, and he pulled all his books and papers and essays out, and we spread them all over the floor. And I was there for a week reading through his library. This is at that top level, that entrance level, looking down at the living room, the piano on the left, and the living room on the right, and the triple height space. This is the living room, looking out to the landscape beyond the fireplace on the right. The stair, the outdoor stair to the left of the living room. We've seen the kids' play area. This is Harry's drawing study, and Harry would come in on Monday morning after, with a roll of sketched drawings, and we would have the task of trying to turn them into hardline drawings, trying to understand what they all meant. And of course, he could get quite frustrated with us as an inability to understand his thought process. But it was a beautiful place to draw. And this is looking back at that with the sandstone shelf, and this is looking up from the creek with the eucalypts and the sandstone and the concrete. It's a big house, but it really nestles into that cliff. So the last, I think the last thing I'll say about Harry's practice in modernism is that he taught. He was a teacher. He grabbed me from my desk and took me into the apartment next door. The apartment was used for guests and entertaining and staying over late nights. I'd been working there for quite some time when he did this. Now, Harry, wore a beautiful suit every day to work. I never saw him out of a suit, except when I visited him at his house. And that suit came with a shirt and a bow tie, always. So, we went next door, and he took me into the bathroom, and he got down on the floor and showed me the plumbing pipes underneath the granite vanity looking up. It was important to him that I could understand, how the waste and the vent worked, and how the hot water bypassed the vent pipe. And he said, "This is what you're drawing. This is how it works, and this is what it is." And because he did that, and he did that with everyone, everybody else did that. So we would do it with each other. You could go to different people in the office and talk about what their interest was, what they were good at, how to make the locks work, how to make the faucets work, how to make the elevation work, how to make the section work. The archive was upstairs in the plant room, all the rolls of tubes. And we were always encouraged to go up there and pull out old projects and go through them. So, part of the time there was spent poring over the drawings to see how things were done in different projects. I used to say back then that Harry would employ the brightest and most talented graduates from Sydney to draw his construction details. And there was some truth to that. Design, what it meant was design was a part of every drawing, even if it was just about how the drawing was laid out or how the lettering and text was organized. But it also meant design was throughout everything. The undersides of things were as intentional as the visible sides. The plant room organization and design was as intentional as the lobby. Design pervaded everything. But sort of looking back on working in the office, I also realized that the experience working there turned us all into educators and mentors and communicators and travelers and observers, to use Jean-Louis' term, documenters of architecture. lover of wonderful environments and makers of thoughtful places. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. This was just incredible to be able to have this insight into how the practice and Harry work. I know we're, past any type of level of timing that we ever had for this lecture, but this is so remarkable and clearly an incredible opportunity to learn about a figure that was so important. I just want to kind of like ask one question, if we can be brief, but it's like, Vladimir, you've curated exhibitions for many years about his work. You've done a remarkable work with the publication. I'm curious to see what the experience has been to travel his work to other places. How much was there a relationship? Like, what is kind of like the current influence of his work and his thinking in Australia, but also in the other places that you've toured that exhibition?
Well, I would say if we're talking about his influence, the lessons that especially our architects could learn from right now, one lesson would be, to travel around the world as much as you can, to meet architects in person, to start collaborations. And this is what architects do anyway, a lot, and they collaborate much more increasingly, in recent years. But there is something that is happening right now in architecture, which is kind of pulling in the other direction, and this is what his lesson could become handy. Architecture is kind of going away from being associated with art, and it's becoming much more calculated, much more precise, and also it is a lot more about defending what you do. Every single step, every single curve has to have a reason. It's about architecture that's performative. It's about architecture that's functional, and all of that you can say about his work. But at the same time, you can see so many ideas are coming from the works of art. No longer you hear architects presenting their work talking about a painting. And you can see how much he learned not only from architects, but also from the artists. So I would say that one of the biggest revelations is that you can actually combine ideas coming from so many different directions, not just art. I'm just saying in his particular case, it was a lot of it was art, but there's also mathematics and history and so many other disciplines. So this is what I would say his lesson. And in his way, and in his case, it was never about aesthetics alone. Again, there is always a construction logic in his work. There is always thinking about economy of means. So somehow architects lost that interest. They've become, in a way, embarrassed about where the ideas are actually coming from. They feel that if they say it's coming from a painting, they would be considered to be, expensive or misunderstood, not relevant. So this is what I think would be a good lesson, and would be interesting to study. That ideas are not only coming from the site. Ideas are not only coming from the brief. That's the point. It's coming from so many directions, and the richer, the better.
Mm-hmm. Jean-Louis, there was a comment that you made about this kind of like urbanity and how a single building is able to capture the tensions of the city, and it's fascinating to see the work of the architect of like this, sometimes like large single family homes with like no surrounding buildings, and like how he excels in some of those that context, but then bringing those ideas into the city. He's also like masterfully able to to be placed there and concentrate those tensions from the city. So if you can just kind of like elaborate a little bit more about how you see those two aspects of his work.
Yes, I think it's difficult to do it in 1 second. I have a parallel. I've been working for years on the work of Frank Gehry. By the way, I've found some interesting letters between the two. And Gehry has the same attitude, trying to crystallize in a building, not exactly what is usually called the context, but understanding an urban situation and responding to it, and with a great freedom. And this is what I want to underline about Harry Seidler. And he built a firm which was dealing with corporate clients, and in a mid-sized firm, but significant one, as Jeremy has remarkably exposed. But at the same time, every design from the firm is a Harry Seidler design. Is totally, I would say, on the opposite end of the discourse of Gropius about collaboration. It's not collaboration, it's individual creativity in a collective context. And in this respect, what I find the most exciting is Harry's incredible freedom to reimagine programs, to avoid repeating himself. And I think it's a mark of a great creative people, to be able to reimagine their work and move away from the cliche representation the world has of them. And Harry was one of these creative minds.
Excellent, thank you. There is a common kind of question on the chat about perhaps the relationship between Harry Seidler and Schindler, like the relationship with the Lobel Beach house. I don't know if through anybody's work you've been able to establish any parallels between them or any influence.
If I can continue, the Lobel Beach house was rather forgotten until the work of Esther McCoy in the 1960s. So I'm not sure. Harry has known it at the beginning of his trajectory, but he was clearly a voracious reader and a voracious observer and traveler. So I can't imagine he would have missed it. At the same time, he goes, and if there is something, a parallel to be made with Schindler, is the what Jeremy was saying is the interest for craft of Schindler doing it by himself. He was also a joiner, a woodworker. Harry bringing back molds from the US in his suitcase, but being very concerned with the craft aspect of architecture. And I think it's also another aspect, handling a little banal to say it, but handling every scale. And this is what Schindler did with a completely different aesthetic perspective, which was largely derived from a sort of hybridization between Vienna and Japan. So, and of course, Frank Lloyd Wright. So it's a different story.
This was great. Again, I just want to thank all three of you, because the presentations and the kind of like the overview that you've done about a super interesting figure that I discovered thanks to Vladimir many years ago. You know, it's just so important to be able to have this kind of like thorough knowledge about the architect, the context in which the architect works, the other contemporary practices, but also like what it means to work in an office, what it is to develop this sense of mentorship or influence in behaviors. I think it's just incredible. So I really want to thank you for providing us with this insight to celebrate what it would have been his 100th birthday. So Jeremy, Vladimir, and Jean-Louis, like it's truly an honor and a great, as someone just said, like a great presentation today. So thanks everybody. I hope we can welcome you to Chicago next time you're in the city, and we'll have more events in the fall. So thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Bye. Have a great summer, everyone.